Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. I am so excited to share the conversation with this week's guest, Dr. Amy Brady. Dr. Brady recently wrote Ice, From Mixed Drinks to Skating Rinks, A Cool History of a Hot Commodity, which shares the history of ice in the United States. It was named a best book in 2023 by NPR and is easily one of the most engaging books I've read this year. And I could not wait to sit down with Dr. Brady to chat all about it. Dr. Brady holds a PhD in Literature and American Studies and has appeared on the BBC, NPR, and PBS. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, with me today is Dr. Amy Brady. She is an author who has made appearances on ABC News, NPR, and PBS, and is here to talk about her book, Ice, From Mixed Drinks to Skating Rinks, A Cool History of Hot Commodity. Welcome, Dr. Brady.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on and dive into this amazing, amazing book. So let's get started. You open up your book with a fascinating story about how you landed on kind of telling the story of ice in America. So, can you share why and how you came to this research?
Yeah, I started researching this book around 2018. That year, there was a horrendous heat wave that was circling the planet. I was visiting my family back in my hometown of Kansas at the time. The heat wave was so bad that it strained the energy grids and it knocked the power out of my parents' house. And of course, we were sweltering without the air conditioner. So we went to a nearby gas station that was running on a generator. And I was filling up a cup of ice to get a nice cold drink to kind of cool down. And I thought, how ironic, right? To that I was driven to seek out ice by a phenomenon that is essentially eliminating ice on the planet. And I thought about this paradox for a long time. It also occurred to me that I hadn't thought twice about whether ice would have been available at a gas station. I could have gone a mile in either direction from my parents' house, at the grocery store, for example, and bought some ice. Ice is everywhere. But that isn't true anywhere else except in the United States. Go anywhere else in the world, and you will be hard pressed to find ice within a mile of your location, let alone in any direction. And I couldn't figure out, why. I started doing some research, like why is ice so prevalent in this country? How did we become a nation obsessed with this stuff? I found a bona fide hole in American history, and I wanted to fill it. So my book was born.
And you go through all sorts of different aspects of ice, but let's talk about Frederick Tudor. Who was he and what role did he play in the ice trade?
The history of ice in America essentially begins with Frederick Tudor. Frederick was an eccentric Bostonian who was born in the late 18th century to an extremely wealthy family in Massachusetts. And that's important to note that he was wealthy because what that meant is that his family had a lot of land. And what that meant is that they had room to build something called an ice house. And an ice house wasn't a house at all. It was something that a lot of wealthy families at the time who lived in northern climates had. It was essentially a deep well that went several feet into the ground where these families could store blocks of ice that they carved out of nearby lakes and rivers to store them all year round so that they could use the ice for things like preserving their game that they hunted or, cooling fevers or putting them in a drink to cool down. When Frederick was a teenager, he traveled to Cuba with his younger brother, John Henry, where there was no ice. This was the early 19th century at this point. There's no electric refrigeration. There's no air conditioning. The only way anyone would have had access to ice is if they lived in a place where it formed naturally, and they would only have used it regularly if they were wealthy people like the Tudors and could store it. So they go to Cuba. It's immensely hot. There's no way to get cool because there's no ice. And John Henry becomes very, very sick. He later dies. We know now it's not because he got too hot. It's because he had something called bone tuberculosis, which is a disease that we've only recently discovered treatments for. Frederick didn't know that. He thought his brother died because he was overheated. And so he put together, which at the time seemed like an outrageous plan to anybody he told, which is that he was going to take the ice out of the lake on his estate and ship it to warm locales around the world, like Cuba. So Frederick Tudor attempted to do this once. He attempted to do it twice. He did it essentially 9 years in a row, failing every single time to actually sell ice. Because even though he figured out how to get ice on a ship, how to ship it long distance, what he never really accounted for is that for someone living in the tropics in, say, 1806, to look at a piece of ice would be like us looking at a unicorn. Like, what is this magical substance? What do I even do with this thing? And so he had to convince people not only how to use ice, but also how to build the infrastructure to support an entire new industry. But Frederick Tudor eventually succeeded and launched what we now refer to as the 19th century American ice trade. And in doing so, fundamentally changed how Americans and people living abroad think of and use ice in our everyday lives.
And one of the ways that ice kind of changed the game is with cocktail culture, specifically when it arrived in New Orleans. So, can you talk about ice's arrival and kind of what it did to the cocktail scene in America and in New Orleans in particular?
Frederick Tudor would not have been successful as an ice salesman if it weren't for cocktails. He officially figured this out in Cuba, right? So when he landed on Cuba for like the ninth year in a row, and nobody is buying his ice, nobody is trusting him. Like, who is this, strange salesman from Massachusetts trying to sell them something, right? But everybody in Havana trusted their local bartender because cafe culture is dominant in that city at this time. So Frederick Tudor goes to the bartenders and says, I'm going to give you some ice for free. And I'm going to show you how to make the most delicious cocktails using your proprietary Cuban rum, your fruits that you're growing right here on the island. But I'm going to show you how to make it cold. And because I'm giving you the ice for free, you can serve your drink lukewarm or at ice temperature. And let's just see which one your clientele prefer. Well, much like today, it's really hard to say no to a drink on the rocks. And so people clamored for it. They loved it. And that was what made Frederick Tudor finally turn a profit in Havana. So he succeeds there. And now that he's proven to himself and the world that you can ship and sell ice at long distances, he turned his eye towards New Orleans. And he chose that city for a couple of reasons. First was just logistics, right? This is, again, the early 19th century. New Orleans, because of where it's located, on the map, just upriver from the Gulf of Mexico, it's one of the largest trading ports in the Western Hemisphere. So he could easily ship his ice there. But the second reason is that New Orleans at this time is undergoing a cultural revolution. People from around the world are coming there and bringing their art, their music, their food, a sense of spectacle and experimentation. Bartenders are already trying crazy ideas to get people to come into their bars. And then here comes this man with a bucket full of frozen water that can literally turn the temperature of their drink. So bartenders can't wait to usher him behind the bar and have them show them how to do his magical drink fixing. So he does. And just like in Cuba, the people of New Orleans can't believe the pleasures of an ice cold drink. And so he sells all of his ice. And within just months of him arriving there, bartenders are creating the drinks that we now associate with New Orleans. New Orleans, the Sazerac, the gin fizz, daiquiris are starting to take on a whole new life of their own. And now, so many of us, myself included, consider New Orleans to be this, cradle of civilized drinking. And that is all thanks to Frederick Tudor and the ice trade.
New Orleans is one of my favorite cities in the world, and so when I saw the inclusion of New Orleans and ICE's impact there, I thought, oh, that's so beautiful, so wonderful. And so Frederick Tudor might have started the ice game, but there are several other individuals who have kind of tailored it and left their mark. So one of those individuals that you talk about is John Gorey. So who was he and how did he alter the ice industry?
John Gorey was a New York doctor who moved to a tiny Gulf town in Florida called Apalachicola. And he moved there because he was hell bent on finding a cure for yellow fever. This was a disease that ravaged the American South every year in the 19th century. Doctors didn't know that the disease was transmitted by mosquitoes. All they knew was that it got really bad in the summer and then it waned in the cooler months. So Don Gorey is living in Apalachicola in the 1840s. So this is about 20 years after Frederick Tudor brought ice to Florida. He knows what ice is. He's also originally from New York, so he knows what ice is. But ice is incredibly expensive. Locals refer to it as white gold. And by July, the ice from up north has all, been used or have melted away. And that's the peak time for yellow fever. Well, this was a problem for John Gorey because, again, all he really knew about yellow fever is that it got really worse in the summer. And so he thought, maybe I can get my patients' bodies to mimic the cycle of the seasons to cure yellow fever, by which he meant, what if I can get them to cool down just like the winter months? And maybe that would take care of the disease. Today we know that wouldn't have worked, but John Gorey didn't know that. And so, he gathered up what little money he could have in July, bought whatever ice was left, and he started experimenting with it. And while it didn't obviously cure yellow fever, it did make his hot, feverish patients much more comfortable. So that was enough for John Gorey. He was like, at least I'm on to something here. But the only way he was going to get enough white gold of ice to cool down his, hundreds of patients was if he learned to make it himself. And so he started applying, the laws of thermodynamics and physics that he had learned in medical school, and eventually figured out how to create a machine that made ice, albeit slowly, but nonetheless, it made a lot of ice. And when he figured out how to do this, John Gorey thought, oh my God. He was like, I'm going to change medicine. Right. And so he went to, every other doctor he could think of. He went to potential investors to scale up his machine. Everybody thought he was a quack. What he just didn't really understand is that for American, culture in the 1840s, and especially in Florida, which was still, kind of a colonial outpost in some ways, right? They thought that to make ice was an affront to God. They called him the blasphemous doctor of Apalachicola. And so he got very, very little interest in his money. But come July, around Bastille Day, he found one person who was interested, and this was the local French consul, Monsieur Rosan. And Monsieur Rosan held a Bastille party every year. And being from France and having a slightly more continental view of ice and culture, he thought this could be a really neat idea, to serve his guests ice cold wine on Bastille Day. And so he purchased a bunch of ice from John Gorey. He made a big show of presenting ice cold wine at his Bastille party, and everyone was so impressed. And John Gorey thought, this is my last hurrah. This is my chance. People are finally going to get interested. But what he didn't know is that some of Frederick Tudor's associates were at that party. And if there is one thing that Frederick Tudor was not going to tolerate was a threat to his financial empire. And what could be a bigger threat to the natural ice trade than man-made ice? And so a week later, headlines up and down the eastern seaboard started to appear that said things like, there's a whack down in, Apalachicola who thinks he can make ice as good as God Almighty. And that officially did away with any lasting hopes that John Gorey had. John Gorey died in 1855, a poor man with his reputation in tatters. And it wasn't until 10 years later, just 10 years later, that, we had the American Civil War, and Southern, chefs, doctors, whoever was using ice suddenly had their supply cut off because of the wartime embargoes. And at that point, Dr. Gorey's blueprints were rediscovered, and the rather, kind of pearl clutching idea that, men shouldn't make ice was done away with out of necessity. And, by 1867, just a couple of years after the World War, John Gorey's ice machine was being replicated and scaled up to, ice plants that took up literally the size of city blocks. And that initiated the man-made ice trade that officially started competing with the natural ice trade.
And you go into how manufactured ice kind of altered American culture. So how did it do that? What kind of impact and influence did it have?
Suddenly, ice was affordable. Almost anybody could buy at least a little bit of it. And so what this meant is that now the average American could have ice, and then the ice box industry took off. An ice box, of course, was the precursor to the refrigerator. It was a literal box with a steel lining that people could store their ice in. This essentially invented the notion of leftovers. People could, store food for, a couple of days at a time without it spoiling. So, people were starting to incorporate, ice into their food and drink, into their diet. But what this also meant is that industries could now incorporate ice at scale to support their work. So the fishing industry now started to spread across the United States. It wasn't relegated to just, a couple of miles inland because fish could be preserved on ice. The meatpacking industry took off. The brewery industry took off. When we think about the largest American brews, Budweiser, Pabst, these are lagers. And lager is a type of beer that can only be brewed and stored at ice cold temperature. It came from Germany, where there's a lot of ice and there's a lot of cold weather. And so now these breweries could start to scale up and ship their ice cold lager across the United States. So it fundamentally transformed, industry in the United States, creating some of the largest industries of the era.
And I was kind of surprised to see that ice had an impact on Theodore Roosevelt's political rise. So could you share that story? Because that was fascinating.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite stories in researching ice. So in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, a brutal heat wave hit New York City. It killed about 1,300 people, which is more than the Chicago fire, right? Like, I mean, this is one of the greatest, loss of life at that time. And the reason why so many people died is because by the 1890s, ice had become a resource on par with coal in terms of importance. Everybody had it. Even the dirt poor immigrants who were living in tenement buildings in the Lower East Side. The thing about these tenements is that, people were living, in incredibly cramped quarters, a dozen people to a tiny room, with tiny, tiny windows. The buildings are made of brick. There's little air circulation. Indoor temperatures could rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days. And people were using ice to cool down. But suddenly, ice wasn't available because the company that was overseeing ice sales in the city had, we now know illegally, hiked the price of ice to a price point that was out of reach for the majority of people living in New York at this time. And so lots of people died, and a lot more people would have died, if it wasn't for the police commissioner who saw what was going on, in the most impoverished communities in the city and said, "This is outrageous. We've got to do something." He called on every, ice company, natural ice, man-made ice working in the city and said, fill your ice carts, bring it to these communities. I'll figure out how to get you paid. Just do it. And we're going to give this ice away for free. And so when the ice carts arrived in these communities, the police commissioner himself helped to unload the ice, get it into the tenements. And the people living there, just were crying with gratitude, thanking him, shaking his hand, and saying, "We will do whatever we can, to support you if you have political ambitions." And well, that police commissioner was Theodore Roosevelt. And it was just 5 years later that his meteoric rise led him to the presidency.
Such a cool story, and not what you would expect, right? Just ice impacts culture, it's impacting politics. So thank you for sharing that story with us. The other another individual that you talk about is Charles Morse. So who was he, and how did he influence the ice trade?
Charles Morse ran the American Ice Company, which was the company that hiked ice prices in New York during this heat wave. He's originally from Maine. He was an extremely wealthy man who had made his money in shipping. And he saw in the latter half of the 19th century an extraordinary money-making opportunity in the ice trade because he saw all these tiny little ice companies, natural ice companies, man-made ice companies competing with each other. And so his financial brilliance was to consolidate them into what, the local Hearst-owned newspaper started calling the Ice Trust, because he was essentially, by the 1890s, owning every bit of ice that was either being shipped to or created in, New York, and at the time, the second different city of Brooklyn, and all the associated boroughs. And, he was not, shall we say, a scrupulous man. All he cared about was the pursuit of wealth. And he, hiked ice prices, essentially to increase the stock prices. He and a lot of the local politicians were shareholders, in the ice trust, and that's really what it came down to. And so, I don't think it's too much to say that Charles Morse was responsible, for the death of those 1,300 Americans who died because they couldn't access the ice that, he was in charge of. Eventually, he was arrested. And it wasn't because of ice price hiking. It was actually, of all things, it was for tax fraud, but at least they got him on something. And kind of an interesting side note about Charles Morse is that even though he was jailed, his criminal legacy lived on, because while he was there, he met an Italian immigrant by the name of Carlos, and we don't quite know what he imparted to Carlos. That's lost to history, but we do know that they became very close. And upon Carlos's release, he started going by the name of Charles Ponzi. And of course, now, is responsible for, kind of the a priori pyramid scheme that we all now refer to as Ponzi schemes. So, not a scrupulous man whose criminal tentacles extend in many directions.
Yes. And we've talked a little bit about how kind of ice impacted commercial industries and commercial spaces, but let's talk about how it influenced convenience stores.
So at the beginning of this interview, I talked about going to a gas station. It was actually technically a convenience store, I think is what what it would consider itself to get ice. And what was so interesting in this research is that I learned that the model of convenience stores, right? This idea that it's a store that sells staples like kitchen staples, like, milk and bread, some canned goods, a few, first aid supplies, possibly gas as well. And always a bin of ice, right out front with the big red letters. Right. That model actually originates from the ice trade, and specifically the Southern Ice Company, which was a man-made ice company in Texas. It originated in Dallas, but soon spread throughout the state. And the Southern Ice Companies had set up what they called kind of the ice posts, right? These small places where people could stop and pick up a bag of ice or a block of ice after, going to church on Sunday or their grocery store or whatever. Well, one of the managers there, this is now like the 1940s, right? Late 1940s, early 1950s, just after World War II. One of the managers thought, well, people are coming here to pick up ice, anyway. And what I'm often hearing them grumble about is, oh, like we have to go back to the store. I forgot a carton of milk or I forgot whatever. And he thought, well, I'm going to increase, business by actually starting to stock those things. So alongside the ice, he started stocking the bread, the milk, the other things. Car culture by the 1950s is starting to take off, especially in the South where there's you have to travel long distances to get from one city to another. And so gas stations are installed and business becomes so great that the Southern Ice Company extends its hours. And soon, by the, mid 1950s, the ice industry itself is starting to wane because electric refrigeration is taking off. So they completely rebrand themselves and decide to name themselves after their hours of operation. And the 7-Eleven is born. And now every, convenience store in America is really modeled off of the 7-Eleven, which got its root from the ice business.
Such a fascinating vignette. Again, one of my favorite parts of the book. And we've talked a lot about the men who have impacted and influenced the ice industry. Let's talk about women. So, what were women's roles in the ice industry and how did it evolve over time?
So the ice industry is one of the first industries to hire women. And this first happened during World War I, when men were being drafted to go fight overseas. But this is the early 20th century. Electric refrigeration is barely a thing. Ice boxes and the ice industry is still one of the largest industries in the United States. And so suddenly to have all these men who were the ones who essentially ran the ice plants, delivered the ice to homes, to no longer, be there to do that work, the owners decided to hire women because we couldn't have this industry crater. And so what I love about this research, we're seeing these photographs of women who, they're small. They're like my size, they're like 5'2". They like, these like little, like, women with these gigantic iron tongs, carrying ice blocks. It usually took two women to do it, up the stairs, of apartment rises and tenement buildings to deliver the ice. And so, yeah, they became ice delivery people. They became, factory workers in helping to make the ice in real time. And, when, men returned from the war, there's certainly like in so many industries, there was this, well, I mean, there was a sense of competition, right? And this, question of whether women should go back home. And many did, but also, many women stayed in the workforce, if not in the ice plants, they got work elsewhere. And then we saw this happen again during World War II, which was kind of the ice industry's last gasp, but still important nonetheless at this point in history. And same thing happened. Women went to work in the ice plants and in ice delivery. And then when the men returned, stayed working. If not there, they went elsewhere. So women in the workforce really became a thing. It got its boost because of the ice industry.
And we've talked a little bit about the cocktail culture originally with ice, But there's another individual who kind of influenced more modern bartenders. So, who was Jerry Thomas, and how did he influence the modern cocktail and modern bartenders?
Love the story of Jerry Thomas because he was just a man of spectacle. And, ask any bartender friend, like who is the father of modern bartending? And they'll say it's Jerry Thomas. You can still buy the so-called Jerry Thomas, bar guide in it, anywhere you can buy books. So Jerry Thomas was a bartender at the kind of the tail end of the 19th century. So the ice trade's in full swing, and he's in New York. He understands, bar culture like nobody else. He trains as a bartender in some of the city's finest bars, and then he decides to go west because he, like so many other Americans, got gold fever. And he went to California, to San Francisco specifically, and spent his days searching for gold up in the hills. And then at night came down to the city, which at this time was essentially a tent town, right? To make cocktails and to make a little extra money. But what was different about him is that, among all of these, gold miners, right? These like rugged people, he was wearing, a leather vest with like fake diamonds, kind of flipping glasses and bottles with flair to really make a spectacle out of cocktail making. And he used ice to make these cocktails. But what's even more important to recognize about Jerry Thomas is that, I mean, the history of cocktail making is in some ways as ephemeral as an ice cube. Right? It melts away because very rarely did anybody write down their recipes, but Jerry Thomas did. And so, he made this big splash, made a name for himself in New York, then San Francisco, and then eventually New York again when he got tired of gold prospecting and went back to the city, but took along with him, those recipes. And today, when we think about, the origins of American cocktail making, we're really thinking about Jerry Thomas's recipes, because they were the first ones to be written down, but they were also the first ones to really incorporate ice in all kinds of, unique ways, and thinking about how ice not just cools a drink, but how it can dilute it or not, depending on what type of ice bartender chooses to use. So anytime you have a nice cocktail, raise a glass to Jerry Thomas. He's really the reason why.
And I love this book for so many reasons, but I just love these random obscure stories that you told, which is one of the ones that I found most fascinating was involving an all ice aircraft carrier. So, can you talk a little bit more about this and how it came up as a potential future endeavor?
This is one of the odder stories of American ice history. So this was during World War II. And, during World War II, some of not just the nations, the world's, most important resources like steel and wood are, in scant supply because everything is going towards the war effort. And so there's this engineer who comes up with the idea to build an aircraft carrier not out of steel, but out of ice. The thinking being that it's plentiful, it's easy to carve, and if it gets hit by a bomb, it's not going to sink. And so FDR, the president at the time, was not terribly interested in this idea. He thought it was a bit strange, but Winston Churchill did. He took it very seriously. And so, he brought together, and paid under the British Crown, several scientists to study whether this idea was feasible. And ultimately, they decided it wasn't, for reasons that I think you and I, as non-scientists, can probably conclude, which is that in the sun, ice is going to melt. And also, ice may not sink, but if it gets hit by a bomb, it's going to fracture worse than concrete.
Yeah.
So it never actually took off, but this really marks, an interesting time in ice history where suddenly, one of the world's greatest militaries was taking it seriously as a substance and actually studying it scientifically. That's the other strange thing about, I learned about ice. It's just that how rarely it has gotten, the same kind of scientific study that so many other common substances have received. It really hasn't.
Yeah. And talking about, the influence of ice and its history, how does the origins of the Madison Square Garden overlap with the history of ice?
Again, kind of going back to the 19th century, P.T. Barnum purchases the arena where the original Madison Square Garden in New York City was, and he brought the idea of large scale spectacle to the world. Right. I mean, he was the greatest showman, right? And so he brought, animals and performers and acrobats. And the other great idea was to utilize this new ice plant technology, right? This idea that ice can be made, by mankind, and use it to create a flat plane of ice to bring ice skating indoors. So, where Madison Square Garden used to be became essentially the first, large scale American indoor ice skating rink. And, people from across the country, actually from around the world, sailed over or took the train in to see ice skating indoors. It also became the kind of the thinking ground for other ways to use ice. Once P.T. Barnum takes, his show elsewhere, what are we going to do with the ice rink that's indoors? Well, this kind of sparked the idea of bringing, ice hockey, which is a sport that, until this time was only played outside and had only recently arrived in the United States. It's already big in Canada, but it was now starting to catch on in the United States. And so, hockey started to be brought indoors as well. And then this sparked, yet another craze for building additional ice rinks indoors across the country. So, Madison Square Garden is really kind of like ground zero for ice hockey, for ice skating, for figure skating, for the notion that Americans can skate indoors all year round, even in summer.
And I think as this conversation has demonstrated, you kind of covered the gamut of all factors of ice and its influence and its history and who's kind of reinvigorated the game. But was there a piece of this history or this story that you were unable to cover?
You know, I think that anytime I've talked to anybody, and I mean anybody, a family member, a friend, a stranger, that I wrote a book about ice, they like to remind me that I didn't speak to their great Uncle Earl, who was an ice delivery man, right? I mean, the thing about writing about the history of ice is that it quite literally touched everybody's lives, right? Like everybody either is related to or knows somebody who was an ice delivery person who owned an ice house, or maybe they took a school trip to visit a local ice house. So I am constantly reminded of all the little bits of history that were not included in this book. But I will tell you actually one interesting tidbit that I didn't include because I couldn't quite prove it happened. And I, as a historian of integrity, I needed to have some sort of a record, but it's too good not to share. So I'll tell you. And that's when I was researching the history of ice's impact on the brewery industry. And I was visiting the Budweiser brewery in St. Louis. And one of the tour guides there said that the original owner of Budweiser was obsessed with ice. So much so that he carved or had dug a moat around the outside of his enormous house, and then had the train tracks that were delivering ice to the brewery have a kind of offshoot that went to his house so that an extra cart of ice could be shipped in, dumped into the moat as a kind of ersatz house air cooling conditioning system. And I thought, this is crazy. Like, is this house still standing? Can I go see it? And, the guide tells me that, no, actually the house hasn't, existed in, almost a century. And then a part of me thought, I wonder if the fact that the house doesn't exist anymore is actually proof that this story is true. Does somebody who has a house with an extremely wet basement, I can tell you the damage that an ice moat around a house is going to do.
And so, what do you hope readers take away from this book?
I hope that it helps them to think of history as not as one story, as not as a monolithic narrative, but as a collection of many, many, many stories with many different people doing interesting things, and that you can find these stories, these individual stories, when you look closely at the everyday objects around you. When I was writing Ice, I thought of an ice cube almost like a prism to the past, right? You kind of shine that light through ice and you get that kind of rainbow of color on the other side. And that's kind of the way writing this book felt, right? Look at history through something as common as a piece of ice, and you are going to see all kinds of things that you wouldn't otherwise know or have ever known. So that's what I hope people take away. Ice, the history itself is a fascinating collection of stories that is so much more varied and diverse than, even many historians fully understand.
Wonderful. That's beautifully said. And so, where should people go when they've finished your book and want to learn more about you and your scholarship?
I hope they check out my website. It's amybradywrites.com. And there they can find updates about, future books I'm working on, essays and articles that I'm publishing, and also where I'll be speaking or appearing on great podcasts like yours. And you can also get in touch with me. If you have questions about ice, if you want me to come to a book club, I'm happy to Zoom in or stop by if you're not too far away. I love doing that. I love talking to people who, whatever their feelings on ice, the fact that they love history and books, those are people I want to chat with. So get in touch. And you can do that by going to amybradywrites.com.
And I'll be sure to include a link to your website in the show notes for the episode. So check it out, everybody. And so we've talked about a lot. We haven't even covered all of the book. So is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want future readers to know?
Oh, I would say that, a question at the heart of my book, right? I mean, my book focuses largely on the past. It's a work of history. But there is a question, which is, can ice in an age climate change exist in our kitchens and at our planetary poles? And I think the answer is yes. There's a lot of new technology being built that is making our refrigerators much more environmentally friendly. I am also a big fan of ice. I don't want to give it up anytime soon. So, know that there is an environmental angle at times in my book, but it is not a depressing book. It's actually a very hopeful one. And writing this book has made me a lifelong environmentalist, even more optimistic about our future.
Lovely. And to all the listeners out there, I highly, highly recommend picking up a copy of this book. Ice is not only a fascinating history, but it is an engaging, thorough investigation of American pop culture, and is a book you won't be able to put down because I could not put it down myself. So thank you again, Dr. Brady.
Thank you so much for having me.
My thanks again goes out to Dr. Brady for sharing her work with me. Ice is a book for anyone and everyone. While academically rigorous, Dr. Brady's writing style is accessible and entertaining, and you won't want to put it down. Be sure to pick up a copy at your preferred book vendor. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.